So, Dan, now I'd like to dive a little more into optimizing leadership dynamics for value creation. And so I have just a couple of questions for you there on that point. That being said, what strategies do you recommend for ensuring the right leadership is in place post acquisition?
Yeah, sure. So, as a bit of a callback to something we were talking about a little while ago, the first thing that comes to mind is do leadership due diligence pre-closing. If you're trying to solve for how do we get the right leadership into place post-closing or post-acquisition, do leadership due diligence pre-closing so you can understand what you're buying and compare that to what you need and sort of position yourself to make any decisions that need to be made to get the right leadership into place quickly post closing. So that's thing number one is just do leadership due diligence. Thing number two, at the risk of being unoriginal, is take decisive action on its findings. This conversation is making me think back to, I think it was Bain that did a study a few years back ago that said something like 90% of survey respondents, this was a survey of private equity professionals, said that waiting too long to take action on talent issues had resulted in portfolio company underperformance. So, to the extent that you have done leadership due diligence and you understand some of the decisions you need to make to power your value creation agenda, the next and final step is to take action on the findings. And I think what this survey is telling us is that a lot of firms either aren't doing the due diligence to put themselves in a position to make decisions or aren't actually taking decisive action. There's all sorts of fear-based reasons that can get in the way of private equity firms wanting to move on these sorts of things post-closing. But the bottom line is if you find yourself a year, 2 years into a hold period, realizing that you need to make a significant management change, it's a diligence issue or it's a failure to act, is putting you in that position.
Take actions on the findings. I hear what you were saying there, but how do leadership dynamics directly impact value creation in PE-backed firms, good or bad?
Well, this Alex Partners study that I referenced earlier, this annual private equity survey they do, said that there's, again, widespread recognition that leadership is one of the most important determinants of investment success. And so, to answer your question directly, I think you have the private equity market is putting their hand up and saying, yes, leadership dynamics do directly impact value creation in PE-backed firms. And it wasn't always that way. It has not always been that way. I shared a bit of my own historical experience in private equity where in the early days of my career in private equity, we sort of fell into the same trap that I think a lot of firms have or are falling into, which is we really aced the deal making part of the business. We got very good at capital allocation and making good deals and doing good deals. The talent was sort of an afterthought. And it took taking a big step back. This is in the early 2010s, taking a big step back and looking at the portfolio performance and doing some of the attribution analysis between different factors and investment returns. It took that look in the mirror moment to realize that, like this Alex Partners survey affirms, the highest correlated factor with our investment success at the time was the degree to which we were intentional about leadership and talent in the companies we were investing in. And so this taught me some important lessons. When even the smartest value creation plan or strategy or deal thesis meets a misfit management team, the misfit management team is going to win. When even the smartest value creation agenda or plan meets a weak culture, the weak culture is going to win.
So, Dan, sorry to interrupt, but are you saying that a clear value creation plan is one thing? It all starts with a good plan, a strategic plan, but then implementing that plan is an entirely different story. I mean, that takes all sorts of different leadership skills, right? So, are you saying that it's like
Right.
Mike Tyson once said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face? And so that's an interesting point. Can you talk more about your approach to aligning leadership with a clear value creation plan? I mean, how do you prevent that disconnect that you're speaking of?
Yeah. So I wrote a book called Winning Moves that has a lot on this topic. So for those that want to really dig into this topic of how do you get aligned on a clear value creation plan, check out the book. There's a lot of practical advice in there. As I think about aligning leadership, the leadership and the board and the investors on a clear value creation plan, this idea of value creation is very generic, and the language of value creation is used a lot in some very generic ways in private equity land. So I sort of, as somebody who needs something concrete, to hang my hat on, I have translated the question you're asking into a set of really 4 sub questions that I think are really important for leadership teams, the boards, the investors to be aligned on. And those are, number one, where are we going? Call it your vision, call it your whatever, but where are we trying to take this thing? In creating a clear and aligned, shared long-term view, a compelling long-term view of where we're trying to take this thing is thing number one. Question number two is, how are we going to get there? You can call this your strategy, your value creation plan, call it your whatever, but what's the path to getting there? And again, the book Winning Moves talks about the framework and methodology around how to define your value creation plan, but you got to answer that question of how are we going to get there? Question number three is, what needs to happen next? Never mind what needs to happen years 4 to 5 of the whole period, but what's the next 10, 15 yards of the journey? And so that becomes about, based on this long-term view, based on the value creation plan or strategy we're trying to actualize, what are the next couple of moves in that direction? And then question number 4 is, who do we need aboard in order to make all of the aforementioned happen? So to cut through a lot of the sort of mystique and misinterpretation around value creation and value creation plan, I would just say simply, to get aligned with your leadership team, answer those 4 questions together. And the word together, I think, is very important because the private equity firm is going to develop a perspective on those questions, whether or not they use the same language I just did. They're going to develop a perspective on the vision, the strategy, the plan, the priorities, the team in due diligence. Management, of course, is coming into the close with a perspective on that too, hopefully. What I believe to be very important is to make sure that the process of aligning, the process of value creation planning is a co-creative exercise between investors and management. What doesn't work is the investors, drawing up a big Gantt chart or a PowerPoint deck of value creation thoughts and handing it to management and saying, here you go. So I'm being a little tongue in cheek here, but I think I've made this mistake in my private equity career of assuming I had, the master plan and expecting management to sort of fall in line with that. And what I realized is 2 things. Number one, I'm shortchanging the great perspective that management is going to have on how to build their business. And number 2, that's not a way to create buy-in. Once you align on the agenda, you need them to actualize the agenda. And it's really important that they be bought in to the shared co-created agenda. In order to create that buy-in, what's the old saying? People need to weigh in to buy in. So this is all to say that the call to action here is answer these 4 questions and do so collaboratively and co-creatively with your leadership team such that you're coming to a clear, shared, and aligned point of view shortly after close on the answer to those 4 questions.